This is HuffPost Live. I'm Mike Sachs. When it comes to the U.S. government's massive national security and intelligence gathering apparatus, are we getting what we're paying for? The answer is, who knows? It's secret! Which begs another question. With programs we're spending millions and sometimes billions on, is it up to people on the inside to sound the alarm when things are going wrong? In a new article for The Nation, journalist and author Tim Shorrock tells the story of the NSA 4, people on the inside of one of America's most secret agencies who took on the issues of bid rigging, cronyism, and abuse at a huge cost to their personal and professional lives. Joining us to discuss this story, we're thrilled to be joined by Ben Freeman of the Project on Government Oversight, Jesselyn Raddick of the Government Accountability Project, NSA whistleblower Thomas Drake, and of course, the man who made all this happen, journalist and author Tim Shorrock. Last but not least, on the phone, we have NSA whistleblower Bill Binney. So Tim, you decided to focus on these NSA 4. Their names, Thomas Drake, William Binney, J. Kirk Wiebe, and Edward Loomis. Why this crew?
Well, they're the 4 whistleblowers who were involved in this complaint to the Department of Defense Office of Inspector General in 2002 about massive fraud, waste, and abuse at the National Security Agency. They reported it to the DOD. As Tom will explain, he was a witness to this. They were joined by one person from the House Oversight Intelligence Committee in this complaint, and they detailed what they had observed and what they had witnessed at NSA with the waste of a program called Trailblazer that was supposed to, in General Hayden, who used to be the director of NSA, it was supposed to, quote unquote, revolutionize the way they collected signals intelligence coming in, foreign signals intelligence.
What is signals intelligence for those unfamiliar with the intelligence world and the many different types of human, SIGINT, what have you?
Well, I'll let one Tom or Bill explain that.
Okay.
You're in the middle of it.
well, Bill, I want to go to you. First, you can tell us what SIGINT is, and then I want to ask you, about in 2002, how you asked the Pentagon to investigate what were millions and millions of dollars of waste they were put into Trailblazer, and how you had another program also called Thin Thread that was already, I hear, up and running by the time this was all going on.
Yes, well, okay. SIGINT basically is 2 parts. One is to do with communications type transmissions, electronic transmissions, like people communicating with others. And the other is just what we called ELINT, which is the electronic signals that are radars and telemetry and things like that aren't people communicating with each other, but are signals to other systems or to detect things moving. And in the SIGINT world, which is where I was, we were interested in discovering threats that would be posed by people who were communicating, setting up potential operations.
And you were in this world before 9/11. When did you start in the world you were in with the NSA?
Well, I started with NSA really in the Army. I was in the Army Security Agency, and that was an affiliate of CSS, which is part of NSA CSS. And that I started there in 1965, and then I was in the Army for until 1969, and then I got out of the Army and became a civilian in 1970 at NSA. And then I retired again at 2001, October, after they started spying on everybody in the United States.
So tell us about that, right? Let's start with Thin Thread, what you were working on, and then let's talk about Trailblazer, which I imagine is what you just alluded to.
Okay, well, Thin Thread was a program designed to look at massive amounts of data, graph it, or build relationships in that data, and then use those relationships to figure out what you wanted or needed to look at as potential threats in it, and what you could just simply throw away. Which was the real benefit of it, was being able to throw all the data away allowed you to manage, terabytes of data a minute. So that was how you could deal with massive amounts of data right at the front end and select out what you wanted.
And you were developing this when? Was this in late 90s, early 2000s?
Actually, it started around 1997 is when we started it. And we had it running by late 2000, and it proposed and had it operationally deployed, and we're using it. And we had proposed to do a general deployment of it in January of 2001.
And if it was deployed in January of 2001, could it have, I don't know, prevented 9/11 from happening?
Well, the point was when you detect, like, for example, Al-Qaeda communicating with somebody else in Al-Qaeda or anybody, really, that would be immediately forward. It was automatic. It wasn't something that was going to lay in your database till somebody came around to find it. This was all detectable by electronics and executable by code. That is, you could take write the code so that anything that happened with Al-Qaeda, you could immediately alert everybody and push it right to the top of their queue to look at. So it wasn't a question of having people go through the data to figure it out. The code would do that for you.
So you had something with code that would do that for you, but ultimately, though, this program, Thin Thread, was not deployed.
Right. And that was because of a multi-billion-dollar, probably a little over $4 billion program called Trailblazer that was set up with the large corporations to have it basically built by the corporations, and they wanted to feed on all this money, and so therefore they had to get rid of us, and they managed to be able to do that with the cooperation of the NSA management.
And Thomas, when it came to the deployment then of Trailblazer, what were you doing what did you see with that? Was it a threat to American privacy with corporations involved with the United States government in collecting our information? How exactly did it work? What exactly made you want to sound the alarm on it?
Well, that was actually a separate program called Stellar Wind, the secret surveillance program. Trailblazer itself just became a multi-billion-dollar boondoggle. It never actually developed or delivered anything except a lot of blazing saddle storefronts, and so it became a basically a virtual bar where a lot of contractors belly up, get a lot of million-dollar handouts. The program continued for 6 years until it had a quiet death in 2006.
And all the while,
in other words, it was never
go
deployed.
ahead.
In other words,
never
it was never
deployed.
deployed.
It never deployed. Never deployed. And how much money was put into it?
The original program pre-9/11 was funded at the nearly $4 billion level. They doubled down after 9/11.
Wow. So, Tim, do you have an exact figure? Do you know how much money was ultimately spent before the program was abandoned?
Well, $4 billion is a pretty good figure. The official figure that we put in the Nation article was 1.2, but I said millions and millions were added from other programs. I learned from their fellow whistleblower, Ed Loomis, that actually Michael Hayden, the director of NSA, went around and collected money, basically, took a wheelbarrow around and got money from lots of other programs that were actually operational and said, Trailblazer is going to do everything for us, so, give us the money, and they did, and they shuffled a lot of money into it. So the important thing to remember about Trailblazer, which I quote Tom saying in the article, is that it never delivered. It wasn't a question of Trailblazer violating anybody's rights because it never delivered. Essentially, NSA put all their marbles into this corporate system that was making money for SAIC, Booz Allen, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and dozens of other small companies, and left this program developed in-house by NSA's own scientists and engineers. They left that on the wayside and went for this big corporate project that never worked, and in fact, it was canceled in 2006.
It's important to point out that fateful strategic decision was made by General Michael that he was going to buy the challenge problem that they faced that had already been solved by Thin Thread. He was going to go to the military-industrial complex and spend billions on a solution that had already been solved, the best of American ingenuity and innovation.
Now, Ben, in Tim's article, he writes that there's systemic bid rigging, right? Cronyism, fraud, involving senior NSA officials. In your research on national security, on spending in national security, how tough is it really to know how much we're spending when it comes to such programs cloaked in secrecy?
Yeah, when you're talking
Oh, and I hear a phone ringing, and I see your screen freeze. So we're going to come back to you. We're going to try to get you on the phone. Stand by. My producers will call you. But Jesselyn, I imagine that some of the work you do also allows you to see really what amount of waste goes
programs.
into.
We can't really know, unfortunately.
Well then, I don't think you heard me say you had frozen, but if you could just start and repeat everything you said, word for word, verbatim, so that we could all hear how much brilliance you just bestowed upon us, we'd love to hear it.
Okay, thanks. Well, I think one of the problems that we have with NSA in all of this is that we don't know how much money that's going into programs like this, let alone how much money is being wasted on it. Because when you bring contractors into this process, where it really is an inherently governmental function, and it's a governmental function that was working. Tom Drake and the NSA-4, they had a system that was working, but that's not profitable for a lot of these contractors who spend a lot of money in campaign contributions and lobbying. And so because it's not profitable, we create all these perverse incentives to contract that work out, and then the incentives are for all of these firms to make more and more profits. It's not nearly as profitable to actually fix a problem as it is to temporarily fix a problem.
But also the problem here is this is intelligence, high levels of intelligence, and it's all classified. So, it's secret.
Which means we have to rely on people like Thomas, people like Bill, to actually say there's something going on here.
Exactly. I mean, there's no real reason for the total amount of Trailblazer to be classified. It shouldn't be a state secret how much money was wasted. Why they keep it a state secret? It's an embarrassment to the NSA, and it's embarrassment to the corporations involved. That's what's going on. There's no reason for this to be secret. There's no reason for much of this to be secret. Jesselyn can talk about this.
Yeah, right. I mean, Jesselyn, there's a problem of overclassification we hear all the time with the government, right? And this isn't just things that are coming out of the NSA, but particularly for things here that have to do with just what's spent, how things are deployed in ways that don't seem to be totally necessary to classify for national security purposes.
No, I mean, there is a rampant overclassification, and the government speaks to that. They don't deny that at all. They don't talk about how to fix it. But in this case, what was so interesting to me is that Bill and Tom and Kirk and Ed blew the whistle to the Department of Defense Inspector General, which actually investigated and substantiated their claims. But then they immediately classified the report so no one could see it. And then a couple years pass, and it appears that the Department of Defense Inspector General sold them down the river when the Justice Department began its pretextual investigation, not into who was warrantlessly wiretapping Americans, but into who supplied that story to the New York Times, which neither Bill nor Tom did.
Now, Thomas, let's get to this, right? When did that happen? When did the book start to get thrown at you from the U.S. government?
Well, I became a target of the investigation in 2006. It was a few months after the Department of Justice launched a massive, turned out multi-year, multi-million-dollar national security, quote-unquote, leak investigation into who were the sources of the New York Times article, the article written by James Rice and Eric Lichtenau in mid-December of 2005, revealing for the first time publicly the existence of the so-called warrantless wiretapping program.
Okay, so is there any connection beyond, I guess, corruption or crazy spending or overclassification between what we were talking about before with the Thin Thread and the Trailblazer project and with the Stellar Wind project you're referring to here that had a massive invasion of Americans' privacy rights?
Well, I think something that wasn't mentioned was that the Thin Thread program had privacy protection features, including anonymization. And the problem with Trailblazer, even though it never delivered, it was completely stripped of those protections. And then we just saw that come to fruition in a different way in Stellar Wind. So I think that's why people often focus on the constitutional component. Thin Thread went out of its way to do things by the book and not infringe Americans' privacy.
And it's important for people watching this to understand that what Bill Binney and Ed Loomis and Tom Drake were working on before, as far as signals intelligence prior to 9/11, was foreign intelligence. NSA is supposed to be collecting foreign intelligence. And in the 1970s, a law was passed, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, because there had been domestic spying in the past by NSA. Congress required there to be warrants before anyone in America, any U.S. person, not just citizens, but people in the United States, were listened to or were put under surveillance. There was warrants. Those warrants were thrown out after 9/11. And also some of the technology that they developed for a thin thread, and I think, Bill, you can talk about this, was what was used in this massive dragnet they did, under Stellar Wind and other programs to spy on Americans.
Bill, your turn.
Yes. Yes. You see, the back end of Thin Thread was a graphing technique that handled massive amounts of data and indexed it and allowed you to look into it without actually having to look at the data, so you could figure out what you wanted from these terabytes a minute going by. So that basically was the only thing they had that would allow them to deal with massive amounts of data covering the entire world, including everybody in the United States. It wasn't just, as they claimed it was they were talking about the FISA court approving what they were doing. Well, that's when they were talking about one end was foreign and one end was domestic. And those were always legal all along. I mean, we could have done that all along. It was just that after the fact we had to get a warrant. We could do hot pursuit on anything like that. So that was always legal. That wasn't an issue. The issue was when they started collecting data on U.S. citizens to U.S. citizens inside this country and doing all the communications analysis of that, which is what they did with Stellar Wind. And Stellar Wind was based on the program, back-end program of Thin Thread. That was the thing that made Stellar Wind work.
And Thomas, when Stellar Wind worked, boy, I guess it seemed to work, and I imagine that's where you started getting into trouble.
Well, we don't know the full extent to which Stellar Wind, and it goes no doubt by different names these days, the extent to which it wired the United States or wireless the United States on an extraordinary extensive basis. We're talking about a massive surveillance program, and they chose to completely bypass the Fourth Amendment in FISA because, as I was told, you don't understand, Tom, we live in exigent conditions. It requires exigent means to deal with the threat. And so, hey, if you're not doing anything wrong, if your data gets caught, the drag, precisely what they were doing. No controls, no notification, not go to the third branch of government. We're certain very senior, congressional, basically the HIPSI and CISI heads of those committees and their deputies that were notified. But even that, it was under very restricted conditions, no staffers, no notes. Rockefeller was so concerned from West Virginia that about what he heard that he had a memo to himself, but stuck it in his safe.
So when it comes to domestic counterterrorism, and we're talking about government spending here, and sometimes spending with non-government agencies, with corporations and contractors, we have a big growth of spending over the last decade. And I have a graph here pulled up. This is from the Washington Post's Top Secret American Project from the other year. In 2003, we were spending $1.6 billion on domestic counterterrorism, $31 billion by 2010. What is that telling us? I mean, I imagine those numbers are for putting together an entire system that didn't exist in 2003. So some of that might be justified. But of that $31 billion that are being spent between 2003 and 2010, what did that include? And Ben, I imagine you could probably answer this pretty well.
Yeah. Unfortunately, again, the answer is we really don't know, because a lot of that information is just simply unavailable where that money goes. There's definitely some sort of plenty of problems going in there, but until we get some sunlight in there to disinfect it, greater transparency over all this, we're not gonna know. And I think taxpayers should be pretty upset about that.
Yeah, and is there a shot for that sunlight ever ever happening. And I'm looking at the camera to ask Bill. I can look over the Hangout to ask any of you guys. Is there any hope, any shot that we could scale back this overclassification, that people like Bill, people like Thomas, who actually say this is a problem and it's not impacting our national security, it's a problem though, won't ultimately have their personal and professional lives just torn apart?
Overclassification has only gotten worse under President Obama. He took the secrecy regime put in place by President Bush and expanded it by an order of magnitude. People are trying to fight that through FOIAs and lawsuits, and even the former classification czar under Bush for 7 years, Bill Leonard, sued his former agency over the overclassification that occurred in Tom's case. I think it's a very difficult thing to challenge, and it is a crime to improperly classify information, but nobody ever gets prosecuted for that. I don't see there being any accountability anytime soon, unfortunately.
And let me add about that $31 billion. I wrote a book called Spies for Hire, which is the only book out about the contracting out of intelligence. As I was doing the work for that book, I got a document from the Office of Director of National Intelligence, which said that 70% of the U.S. intelligence budget goes to private contractors. That's 70. Huh. So, that's 3/4 of the budget goes directly into the coffers of companies that are named in this article, like SAIC, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and so on. So, there's no reason Congress can't take a look as part of its oversight capacity to say exactly how much we do spend on contracting.
Now, is there an argument, though,
classified information about that?
Is there an argument that contractors can actually do the job more efficiently than the federal government, and that many people working for these contractors did come from the public sector and know it well and perhaps could do the job just as well, if not better?
Well, I think Trailblazer shows you that they cannot.
That's the basic myth.
When you hand it all over to them, no, they cannot. They have two loyalties. One might be to the country and our national security, but they're loyal to the dollar. They are loyal to profits. That's the purpose of what they do. They want one contract, they want to get another contract. That's what they're all about, is making money. So, that's different than protecting the citizens of this country.
And Thomas, you were on both sides of this. You were a contractor as well as a person working at the NSA.
Yes, I give people their due in terms of the profit, but not to sell out national security for the sake of profit while forsaking our freedoms and liberties. That's the perversion here. There was no incentive to truly solve the real problem, and here they rejected the very solution that had solved it. Of course, there was no money program that $15 that solved the core challenge problem in doing data analysis on massive amounts of information. So, the incentive was, let's go out to the military-industrial complex that give them billions and solve the solution for us.
And Bill, I heard you say something about a myth.
The myth is that contractors can do the job when, in fact, they don't have the skills and knowledge necessary to make it happen. The point is, this is an analytic issue. The solution is analytic. It's not engineering or computer science. It's an analytic issue. How you solve and make intelligence out of data. That's an analytic problem. So they're giving an analytic problem to contractors who aren't in that business at all. And so therefore they don't even know how to do it. And that's why they fail all the time. And Trailblazer is only one program they failed at. I know at least half a dozen others.
Jesselyn, you wanted to say something.
I lost my, well, what I was going to say is that Tom and Bill were told that Thin Thread, it needed to cost more money, and it only cost $3 million. And therefore, unless they could make it more expensive, there was no incentive to keep it. Trailblazer essentially became purely a funding vehicle. And the more problems you create, the more problems you can solve and the more money you can get. And I think that's what people don't realize. This is a problem that could have been solved with a $3 million program that worked. And instead, they went with the multi-billion-dollar program that never delivered.
And I think, what Ben said, go ahead.
Yeah, you keep the problem going so you can keep the money flowing.
That's right.
And what Ben said earlier is very important about the pressure from, the contractor pressure and pressure from Congress too, right?
And Ben, I saw you nodding along there.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with everything everybody's saying. There's such a perverse incentive system in place to exactly as everybody said, to keep these contracts going, to not necessarily solve a problem, but to provide a temporary Band-Aid and to be able to keep providing that Band-Aid to keep the money rolling in. You know, the moment you actually solve a problem or deliver a final product, well, then the money stops. And, you know, that's bad for stockholders, so we can't do that.
So, Bill, what is then the solution?
Well, I would. I'm kind of a radical at that. I would get rid of anybody who doesn't do things and make smart decisions. So I think we need to fire at least 4 levels of management in these agencies. Now, I'm not eliminating to NSA. I mean, this is throughout the government. I mean, it's so inculcated in their system to do this kind of thing. It's just corruption all over the place.
I mean, in my view, we have to focus on the mission of the agencies. What is the mission? The mission is to protect. In the case of the National Security Agency, it's supposed to be to protect the American people, you know, from enemies, domestic and foreign. You know, it's supposed to protect us. When they move away from that mission, that becomes a serious problem. We see this throughout the government, where so much of the essential work of agencies like this have been contracted out and privatized with no oversight whatsoever.
Yeah, not sell out national security and what are inherently governmental functions to contractors for a profit. I mean, that's really what's happened here.
Yeah. Here's part of the problem. I moved, when I retired from NSA, I went into contracting too. And so I tried to do some work with other agencies, not NSA, but I tried to suggest to them the things that were important to do. And I was told, even within the companies that I was subcontracting to stop that and just do what they want. Well, I mean, that's just that just set the whole thing up for failure.
It was a compelling conversation we've had, and Bill, I want to thank you for joining, and Thomas as well. I want to thank you. I know you guys have had some issues, had some problems since you guys rang the bell, blew the whistle. But you're doing really good work in getting the word out there.
Yeah, we were criminalized for speaking truth to power.
Yeah.
Well, there it is. And Tim, thank you for telling their story. The article you wrote is in our resource well. Viewers can see it right beneath us. Ben and Jesselyn, thank you as well for joining. This is HuffPost Live. And this conversation, which we've had before on HuffPost Live, and I'm sure we will have it again here on HuffPost Live, unfortunately, will continue.